Hello, and welcome to Wetlands and Disaster Resilience, Leveraging Ecosystem Services for Community Preparedness. My name is Caitlin McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Education, Associates, and Corporate Partnerships here at the Environmental Law Institute. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this ELI Public Seminar and the celebration of the 2020 National Wetland Awardees. At the end of today's program, we will have time for a question and answer session. Please submit your questions through GoTo's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to start today by thanking my colleague Cassantha Moodley, who along with her team has pivoted to an all-digital format for this year's National Wetland Awards and program and brought significant success to this area with her leadership. I would also like to take a moment to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today to lend their expertise to this webinar. While they will be introduced momentarily, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I would encourage you to check out their expertise in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to welcome ELI's President, Scott Fulton. As President of the Environmental Law Institute, Scott has a steadfast commitment to ensuring the Institute is a leader in convening, educating, publishing legal scholarship and policy dialogue, and researching a variety of key environmental topics. He is also focused on making sure that ELI is adapting and modernizing in alignment with a rapidly changing world. Scott previously was principal at Beveridge and Diamond and served as general counsel of the Environmental Protection Agency and in a number of other high-ranking government leadership positions. We're thrilled to have him joining us today. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Caitlin, and good greetings, everyone. Really is my pleasure to kick off today's program and the wonderful forum that I've been assigned, which is to announce this year's recipients of the National Wetlands Award. ELI has since 1989 had the privilege of running this Wetlands Awards program, and as it happens, Eric Myers, one of our panelists on today's program, was one of the initiators and envisioners for this program, and how wonderful it is that we get to celebrate this day with him as part of the agenda. But this is a program that has honored over 200 champions of wetlands protection over the last 30 years. These awards recognize individuals who have demonstrated exceptional effort, innovation, and excellence in protecting wetlands as part of our country's critical ecosystem infrastructure. Past awardees have shared a tireless dedication to ensuring the long-term sustainability of the many ecological, economic, and societal benefits that wetlands provide. And this year's awardees carry forward this proud tradition. The pandemic has prevented us from holding an in-person award ceremony this year, but we are carrying out a virtual recognition campaign through the month of May to celebrate the many achievements of these awardees. In addition to today's recognition, the campaign has featured blogs, videos, podcasts, and written publications, most or all of them by this year's winners. So to view these materials, check out the link that I think you can see on your screen, but it's elinwa.org. But also search social media at hashtag Wetlands Awards 2020. The National Wetlands Award Program is the product of many hands. While administered by the Environmental Law Institute, the program is supported by US EPA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the US Forest Service, and NOAA Fisheries. And a committee of wetland experts representing federal and state agencies, academia, conservation groups, and private sector organizations serves as the blue ribbon panel that selects the award winners. Many thanks to both the supporting agencies and the members of the awards panel for making this important recognition possible. I'm happy to say that, as evidenced by the large number of nominations that we received this year, the most we've received in recent memory, wetlands protection continues to be a vitally important issue area. even in times in which we're challenged by mega issues like the coronavirus and climate change. Indeed, as knowledge grows about the role that loss of critical habitat plays in the jumping of viruses across species, and as the light is shined ever more brightly on the role of wetlands and coastal resilience and water conservation in a climate-sensitive era, perhaps we will see these mega trends reinforcing rather than diluting the importance of wetlands protection. This year, we are honoring a champion in each of the 6 National Wetlands Awards categories. Those categories are youth leadership, scientific research, promoting awareness, local stewardship, business leadership, and wetlands program development. You can find a complete write-up of the accomplishments of all of these distinguished individuals on the website, but let me introduce these folks to you briefly and highlight some of their accomplishments. First, Trinity Fawaz for youth leadership. Trinity is 13 years of age and has been an amphibian and wetlands conservationist since 2016, when she became the mayor of Amphibieville for the Detroit Zoo. Soon after, Trinity began her Action for Amphibians project, which takes a social, political, and hands-on approach toward amphibian and wetland conservation. Through her program, Trinity seeks to raise social awareness via social media, and her Amphibian Conservation Rocks, which is a painted rocks campaign, to conduct field research, clean up local wetlands, educate and inspire her classmates, as well as collect valuable field data as a citizen scientist for Frogwatch USA, and raise political awareness for amphibian and wetland conservation statewide and nationally. This year, Trinity was able to expand her Amphibian Conservation Rocks campaign using funds from the Warner Brothers Scooby-Doo Do Good grant. I have to say that ours is not the only honor that Trinity has received. Her work has been honored and recognized by the National Wetlands Award for Youth Leadership, the Action for Nature Award, the Future Leaders of Amphibian Conservation Scholarship, the John Muir Environmental Youth Advocacy Award, the Daily Points of Light Service Award, and even the President's Environmental Youth Award. So congratulations, Trinity. You are now also a recipient of the National Wetlands Award. Next, we have Dr. John W. Day of Louisiana State University for scientific research, and John will be with us as a panelist in today's program. A PhD in marine and environmental scientists, Dr. Day has taught at LSU since 1971. In addition to educating the next generation of environmental stewards, he has conducted extensive research on the ecology and management of coastal and wetland ecosystems, with emphasis on the Mississippi Delta. An extensive writer with more than 400 publications to his name, Dr. Day has written and edited 14 books, published more than 250 peer-reviewed articles, and has been cited some 24,000 times. By virtue of his prolific and impactful scholarship, he currently has a rating of 79 under the H Index, which is a rating system that rates scholarship on the basis of productivity and impact. Given that a rating of 60 is considered exceptional, Dr. Day is clearly beyond exceptional. His most cited publication is the textbook Estuarine Ecology, which is widely used as a reference book for graduate level education across the country. In addition to his scientific research contributions, Dr. Day is committed to educating the next generation of coastal and environmental scientists And in keeping with this objective, he has served as a major professor for some 70 master's and PhD students over the course of his career. He's a recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship for study in France and the Estuarine Research Federation Cronin Award for Excellence in Teaching in Coastal Sciences. And it is our great pleasure to recognize Dr. Day with the National Wetlands Award for Scientific Research. Congratulations, John. Next, we have Robert Wade of Plumas County Office of Education, being recognized for promoting awareness. Rob has worked in the Upper Feather River region of California's northern Sierra Nevada for the past 25 years. As an outdoor education and science coordinator for Plumas County Office of Education since 1995, Rob has designed, developed, and implemented successful and sustainable K-12 programs built upon a strategic partnership with over 32 agencies and organizations. A mentor for teachers and students alike, here are just a few of the products of his efforts. The 6th grade Feather River Watercourse and Plumas to Pacific trip. This is a year-long adventure and investigation of the local watershed from the Sierra to the sea. And since the year 2000, every 6th grade student in the watershed has participated in this rite of passage to better understand their watershed and the role that their Feather River plays in hydrating the state through the California State Water Project. The Learning Landscapes Partnership, which has served to conserve the 15 properties within a 10-minute walk of the area's public schools, turning each of these areas into an active outdoor classroom. The Fire Restoration Partnership, which is a partnership with the Plumas and Lawson National Forest focused on education and action in response to catastrophic wildfire. This partnership has produced some 300 restoration projects over the last 10 years, including projects focused on fish and amphibian passage, erosion control, and beaver dam and construction and monitoring. Rob is the 2017 recipient of the Excellence in Environmental Education Award that's presented by the California Environmental Education Foundation. And it's our pleasure to add the National Wetlands Award to his list of achievements. Congratulations. Next, we have Sam Lovell, receiving the award for local stewardship. Sam, who is with Friends of the Detroit River, has over 35 years of professional landscape architectural experience in the design, construction, and grant writing for park, riverfront, trail system, urban, and environmental planning projects. Sam also teaches planning and landscape architecture at Michigan State University. He has been the project manager for numerous riparian planning projects in Southeast Michigan and led the development of master plans for the Rouge River Gateway and the Detroit River International Wildlife Refuge Gateway site, and an opportunity assessment for the lower Detroit River. Most recently, Sam was a project manager for the Friends of the Detroit River, as I mentioned, successfully completing the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative projects associated with the Detroit River, funded through NOAA at several locations on the Detroit River. This current work involves completing construction to restore Lake Okanoka on Bell Island and planning for habitat restoration on Sugar Island and at Hennepin Marsh. A local leader and innovator with an enormous body of accomplishments who casts a long national shadow, we're honored to recognize Sam with the National Wetland Award for Local Stewardship. Next, we have Mark Beardsley of Buena Vista, Colorado for business leadership. Mark is the principal of the company Ecometrics, bringing to his work 24 years of experience as an ecologist and geomorphologist with a specialty in small streams, beaver restoration, monitoring and evaluation, and environmental ethics. Mark has been heavily involved in Colorado's stream management planning process and has played a key role in producing holistic stream and wetland health assessment methods, including the functional assessment of Colorado streams and the Colorado Stream Health Assessment Framework. He has also worked as a college biology and chemistry teacher, a climbing guide, a ski patroller, and an avalanche forecaster. And Mark combines all of these experiences to bring fresh perspectives and creative approaches that draw on the power of natural processes and ecological health and planning Colorado's water and environmental future. Mark founded and leads Riparian Reconnect and the Badger Creek Partnership. These are two grassroots efforts in Colorado developed to amplify process-based stream and wetland restoration and beaver-based solutions to Colorado headwaters. Starting from scratch, these programs have grown over a 10-year period to expand ecological restoration over about 30 miles of stream corridor and 500 acres of riparian wetland habitat. He is an innovator in the concept of ecological health and restoration and is a strong advocate within the restoration community for nature-based solutions. And it's our pleasure to recognize Mark's important contributions with the National Wetland Award for Business Leadership. Last but certainly not least, Ted Lagrange of Nebraska for the Wetlands Program Development National Wetlands Award. Ted has been the Wetland Program Manager for the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission for 27 years, working on a variety of wetlands issues throughout Nebraska, including private land restoration programs, public lands management, research, regulations, and outreach. His primary points of focus are prairie wetlands and waterfowl and waterbird ecology. Ted has been a leader in partnerships, playing an integral role in some of the most important partnerships in Nebraska and in his region. He has, for example, led and organized efforts involving over 30 agencies and organizations throughout Nebraska. And collectively, over the past 25 years, some 100,000 wetland acres in Nebraska have been protected or restored as a direct result of Ted's work and leadership. Ted has also been a leader in scholarship, an adjunct faculty member at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Ted has to his name over 50 publications advancing wetland science in multiple journals. He's also a well-known wetland speaker and educator who has helped build wetlands protection capacity for state and tribal governments in his region. He's also active as a leader and discussant in wetland restoration and protection convenings by EPA and the Association of State Wetland Managers, a body of work very much deserving of the National Wetlands Award for Wetlands Program Development. Congratulations. So there you have it, folks, this year's awardees. I'm sure you'll want to look at the materials on the website, the blog posts, and other expressions by these very important figures in our field. And I trust that you will join me in congratulating all 6 of these champions of wetlands protection who have contributed so much to wetlands conservation. On behalf of present and future peoples, we thank you all for the gift of your service. And with that, on to today's program, and back to Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Scott. We really appreciate your remarks and leadership with this program. I would like to now introduce our expert moderator this afternoon, Eric Myers. Eric is the Vice President of Climate and Water Sustainability at the Conservation Fund, where he leads projects on climate adaptation and resiliency, provides leadership on urban and coastal water sustainability relationships, and assists with mitigation efforts. Eric's recent projects include pioneering coastal marsh adaptation work at Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge and a national nature-based coastal protection initiative led by the Army Corps of Engineers and NOAA. Previously, Eric was Vice President and General Counsel for the Environmental Law Institute. Eric, we're delighted to have you joining us today, and with that, I will turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, Caitlin and Scott, for those great remarks. It's really delightful to be part of this celebration of the National Wetlands Awards program, and a great honor to be on the same panel with one of this year's awardees, John Day. John, we really salute your career that has been spent advancing scientific knowledge of wetlands ecology and understanding across the country. So this is wonderful. Looking forward to your remarks in a moment. And it's great to see this program's growth and the increase in visibility that it makes in celebrating the vital contributions that wetlands make to the health and wealth of this nation. They're truly natural and national treasures, whether on our coasts or along our rivers or scattered across the plains in glacially scoured potholes. And in particular, and the subject of today's seminar, American coastal communities and state and federal resource agencies are rediscovering the value that wetlands can play in buffering communities and infrastructure from such climate effects as rising sea levels, storms and storm surge, wind and wave-driven erosion. Inland, these ecosystems hold, store, slow, filter increasingly heavy downpours and help communities and wildlife through prolonged droughts. Whether the wetlands are forested bottomlands or peat-heavy coastal marshes, wetlands also sequester carbon and hold methane-rich soils to mitigate the extent and rate of climate change. So, to discuss what's being done to harness the climate mitigating power of these natural systems, we've got a great panel today. Let me introduce them briefly. And as Caitlin had stated at the outset, there's more biographical material on each of the speakers on the ELI website, and I'd encourage you to go there and look up the details. Leading off, we'll have Stephanie Robinson from the NOAA's Office of Coastal Management in Charleston, South Carolina. She's a coastal management specialist there and works with NOAA's National Estuary Reserve Program and is an expert on natural coastal infrastructure. Stephanie will be followed by Nicole Cardozo. And Nicole is a natural resource resiliency planner with Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Chesapeake and Coastal Service. That's a long, long title. She's based in Annapolis, Maryland, and she's now leading DNR's Resiliency Through Restoration initiative. Truly an outstanding one, and you'll learn more about it in a moment. Nicole will be followed by John Day. John is, as Scott previously identified, an emeritus professor with the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. And obviously, you know, he is a 2020 National Wetlands Award winner for scientific research. His work on ecology and management of coastal and inland wetland ecosystems since 1971, when he earned his doctorate from UNC, have been simply outstanding and truly advanced the state of our understanding and ability to manage wetland systems better. After John speaks, I'll make a short presentation as well, and then we'll take questions. Again, just to remind you that Caitlin will be monitoring the chat box and directing questions to me to pose to the speakers. So with that brief introduction, Stephanie, would you get us going into the heart of this seminar today?
Sure. Thanks. I'm glad to be here today. I think introducing me as an expert of any kind in the company of yourself and John and Scott and the awardees, I'm feeling a little humble about being termed an expert in anything. My name is Stephanie Robinson, and I work with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, as Eric mentioned. I'm sitting in Charleston, South Carolina. And I work as a liaison with the National Estuarine Research Reserves here in the Southeast. I'm going to kick off the discussion by setting the stage about the benefits of natural infrastructure and what NOAA is doing to contribute to the advancement and use by communities to enhance their resilience to coastal hazards using these types of approaches. So I'll start with a quick overview of our, oops, I think I went one slide too far. There we go. I'll start with a quick overview of our mission and vision. NOAA's mission, in short, is one of science, service, and stewardship, and our guiding vision is a future where our communities, ecosystems, and economies are healthy and resilient in the face of change. Across the agency, we work to understand and predict the changes in climate, weather, oceans, and coasts to share that knowledge and information with others and to conserve and manage coastal and marine ecosystems and resources. And one of the threads that weaves across much of the work that NOAA does and that we think is really a critical component of resilient ecosystems, communities, and economies is natural infrastructure. So it's really great to see that as a focus today. Quickly to define natural infrastructure, I'll use a range of phrases today, including natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions, green infrastructure, natural and nature-based features. I use natural infrastructure the most. We've heard that there are just a number of terms that people use for these types of infrastructure. And what we mean by it is the systems within the existing natural environment, including wetlands, forests, beaches, and dunes, as well as engineered systems that are built to mimic those natural systems and their functions and processes. Examples would be things like living shorelines or bioretention systems. Oops. So this is just a graphic that we use often to provide an overview of the breadth of coastal natural infrastructure. And across NOAA, we work in this space in a variety of ways. We conduct research to better understand the services provided by these different ecosystems, including, for example, the efficacy of different approaches to reduce coastal hazard impacts. And we develop products and tools to help our partners plan for natural infrastructure, support conservation, restoration, and creation of natural and nature-based solutions, and we help educate the public on the multiple benefits associated with these systems. Natural infrastructure provides a whole suite of benefits, as Eric mentioned, including helping communities reduce risks from coastal hazards, helping them manage stormwater, protect our coastal water quality, provide critical habitat for commercial fisheries and protected species, and give the nation opportunities for recreation and relaxation, which we all know is really important to, opportunities to recharge ourselves these days. Briefly, the approach we take within my office, I'll narrow in on resilience because that's the focus of our panel today. This ecosystem service, when we work with communities and partners trying to reduce the impact of coastal hazards, we encourage stakeholders to really focus in on the priorities for their communities. In this case, the example would be flooding. And then we encourage them to consider which specific ecosystem service or benefit natural infrastructure could provide to reduce that hazard. There are often a large number of potential natural or nature-based solutions that could help, but not all may work in a given area. So we then encourage stakeholders to consider which options may be the best fit for their geography and setting. And the photos here on this slide just illustrate one application of this approach here in Charleston, where existing salt marshes were conserved and then waterfront parks were created to help stem coastal floodwaters before they reach the streets and buildings of Charleston. Whoops. Sorry, y'all. I managed to keep over clicking by one each time. Although concrete economic data on the benefits of natural infrastructure can be hard to find, there are an increasing number of studies being conducted to help demonstrate this benefit, including this recent study, a few years old now, done by the Nature Conservancy and Lloyd's of London. In a modeling study they conducted following Hurricane Sandy, they found that wetlands prevented more than $625 million in property damage. So as damaging as that storm was to that geography, they found that it could have been much worse. And annually, they found that wetlands reduce flood damage by more than 15%. So if we maximize these types of approaches, we can maximize that loss as well, or sorry, minimize that loss. Another example of a coastal hazard impact that can be mitigated using natural infrastructure is erosion. Ongoing studies in North Carolina, where these photos came from, are focused on how effective living shorelines are at protecting property from erosion during a hurricane. In this particular study, they found initially that before and after Hurricane Irene, which was a Category 1 storm in the coast, marshes with and without sills, these rock structures here that are incorporated into the living shorelines in some cases, were more durable and protected shorelines from erosion better than bulkheads, which are the typical approach to protecting eroding shorelines during this storm. 76% of the bulkheads were damaged in that storm, and it was just a Category 1, but little or no damage occurred to shorelines, whether they had sills or not, if they incorporated natural features like living shorelines. So that just goes to prove that these not only are effective, but they're on large scale, like the Hurricane Sandy study, but also at the local scale and to homeowners and property owners. We also know that in addition to people wanting to know if green infrastructure is effective, communities are looking for incentives to support wetland conservation or natural infrastructure. For example, here in South Carolina, the town of Folly Beach is using FEMA's community rating system to provide flood insurance savings to policyholders by conserving large areas of marsh. And by conserving wetlands, dunes, and other natural features, these communities can receive credits that result in reduced flood insurance premiums. Folly Beach is saving about $1,041,000 annually on flood insurance for its policyholders by implementing this community rating system and conserving wetlands. And that breaks down to an average of about $652 per homeowner policy. If you want to learn more, you can go to the link about that. So these last few slides really just serve to demonstrate the breadth of work that's being done around the country and of course also around the world to verify that natural infrastructure can and does effectively help to protect coastal communities from hazards, and that using these approaches also makes good economic sense in a lot of cases. Oops, sorry, missed a slide there. So how does NOAA support and promote natural infrastructure? First of all, I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of line offices within NOAA that are involved in this topic, and I know some of the other speakers may mention some work being done by other offices later on. But NOAA participates in developing guidance, providing funding, and doing on-the-ground projects. I'm mostly going to highlight activities from the Office for Coastal Management. And as we define it, coastal management covers the decisions and actions taken to keep the natural environment, built environment, quality of life, and economic prosperity of our coastal areas in balance. The Office for Coastal Management addresses coastal issues from all angles, including science-based decision-making, stewardship, education, innovation, and investment. And we do that mostly through partnership approaches. The resources that we provide include everything from research and implementation grants to technical assistance, tools, and products, and also training. And I'll get more into those later on. Okay, I'll start with our partnerships. Our partners are diverse and include state coastal management programs, state emergency managers, the private sector, professional associations, academia, individuals, and other federal agencies, whoever is appropriate for the issue at hand. And we believe that this partnership approach enhances our efficiency and our effectiveness. The Office for Coastal Management oversees the implementation of some federal mandates, including the Coastal Zone Management Act, and provides financial and technical assistance to coastal states, territories, and communities. Our primary partners are these coastal zone management programs and the National Estuarine Research Reserves, and they provide day-to-day or implementation of these programs and management of the resources on the ground. So they're the ones out there doing the work. We have 4 major partnership programs that make up the Office for Coastal Management, and each relies on collaboration across all sectors in order to be successful. So in addition to the 2 coastal zone management partners I listed, the National Estuarine Research Reserves and the Coastal Management Programs, we also work with the Coral Reef Conservation Program and the Digital Coast Partnership. You'll hear more about these programs and partners and the types of work they're doing in the next few slides, and I'll wrap up with some examples of the resources we provide through the Digital Coast later on. As you heard in my introduction, one of the key programs that I work with is the National Estuarine Research Reserves, which is a system of 29 areas across the country dedicated to research, education, and stewardship of the nation's estuaries. Many of these reserves across the system have ongoing research projects to better understand natural infrastructure and how its ecosystem services can be maximized. For example, the reserves in South Carolina received funding to work in conjunction with the state's Coastal Zone Management Program to help inform regulations that will guide permitting and construction of living shoreline projects here in South Carolina. Historically, because of a big knowledge gap about best practices and effectiveness of living shorelines, it has been much easier to get a permit for hardened structures like bulkheads than it has been to get a permit for greener or more nature-based approaches like living shorelines. This project analyzed data from existing living shoreline projects. It also installed and monitored additional experimental living shorelines to test the effectiveness of different treatments. And they also conducted case studies and interviews with property owners to gauge their interest in these types of solutions and their opinions about them. The project produced detailed information about the performance of different living shoreline treatments over time and under a range of conditions. And the project team developed a technical report to guide living shoreline regulation, an extensive monitoring data set, and a decision tree for property owners who are considering living shorelines. Ultimately, this research, again, is intended to streamline the permitting process here in South Carolina so that living shorelines will be easier for property owners to implement. And the next steps in this project include actually developing regulatory language and developing trainers for some non-traditional stakeholders like marine contractors. Projects such as this one demonstrate how the reserve programs move beyond just research, but they're also engaging a number of stakeholders, such as those marine contractors. Reserve programs also provide training for additional non-traditional stakeholders like real estate professionals. And these training opportunities offer these sectors information on costs, benefits, and help translate the research that they're doing into practical methods that can be used by these professionals. So just really translating that research into policy. Another area of research within the reserves is thin layer placement of sediment. This is an emerging strategy to protect tidal marshes that are threatened by rising seas. A research team across the reserve system tested the use of thin layer placement at 8 different reserves and developed guidance to inform future research and restoration projects that use this technique. This is a continuing study. Many of the reserves are moving beyond the first year that was provided of funding to continue looking into this and determine its effectiveness. And finally, through our partnerships, NOAA is also involved in on-the-ground restoration projects such as this one, restoring the Heiau watershed in an area that has since been established as the newest National Estuarine Research Reserve in Hawaii. The work in Heiau is focused on restoring traditional wetlands, estuaries, and coral reefs to build coastal and community resilience. Historically, these wetlands were known for abundant taro crops and naturally healthy fish ponds, but changing land management practices led to increasing runoff, invasive species, and sedimentation. So now partners are reintroducing traditional farming to the Heiau wetlands to minimize flood damage, reduce sediments and nutrients flowing out onto the reefs of the bay, and they also provide healthy food and clean water to the local community by removing that invasive vegetation and replanting the wetlands with the traditional taro fields and other lowland crops. This is a great example of both the multiple benefits that restoration can provide, such as enhanced resilience, but also the power of partnerships, volunteers and community groups, and funding from the Hawaii Coastal Zone Management Program to make it all happen. The reserve is going to move forward supporting ongoing restoration in this area. And when restoration is complete, the freshwater will once again flow unimpeded from upland forest through the wetlands to the reefs of the bay and nourish native plants and animals and the people of the community. I want to highlight that here at NOAA, we also work closely with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to implement the National Coastal Resilience Fund, and we partner across NOAA to identify and address research and data needs. The National Coastal Resilience Fund is a program that provides grant funding for coastal resilience projects that both provide communities with enhanced protection and buffering from impacts of sea level rise, changing flood patterns, coastal erosion, and increased frequency and intensity of storms, and protect and restore habitat for fish and wildlife. In the example here, you see the causeway out to Tybee Island in Georgia. And this flooding on that causeway was not the result of a storm. This is just typical coastal flooding that can happen with king tides and things of that nature. So with funds from the National Coastal Resilience Funds, the city was able to develop a response to this repeated coastal flooding. And this is just one example here in the Southeast. There are a number of projects that have been funded through this program located all across the country to help manage stormwater, reduce coastal flooding, and otherwise increase community resilience. And because of the additional focus on habitat restoration, they all feature some sort of natural infrastructure, whether it's marsh restoration, hydrologic restoration, living shorelines, or dune restoration. Oops. All right, I quickly did want to dig into the Office for Coastal Management's Digital Coast. We, as I mentioned, focus on providing technical assistance tools and training to help build capacity in coastal states and communities. The Digital Coast is our platform for delivering that content, and it leverages the expertise from another suite of partners, the Digital Coast partners listed on this slide, which includes national organizations such as the Nature Conservancy, the American Planning Association, and many others. These partners help us ground truth the resources we provide and connect back to case studies such as the ones I've highlighted already in the previous slides. I wanted to quickly share some of these resources that we have to support the use of natural infrastructure and that may be helpful when thinking about reducing hazard impacts that can be, all of which can be accessed from the comfort of your desk through the Digital Coast website. So to get straight to natural infrastructure, we have a natural infrastructure topics page that you can see here on the screen, and it's a great starting point to find everything that we offer relevant to green infrastructure. You'll find information on training opportunities such as our nature-based solutions for coastal hazards. This is a course that prepares coastal planners and managers for planning and implementing green or natural infrastructure projects to reduce coastal natural hazards in their communities. And we invite local speakers to share what green infrastructure approaches they have used to reduce coastal hazard impacts. We also have several learning resources like our Mapping Green Infrastructure, which shows spatial analysts how to incorporate nature-based solutions or green infrastructure into their GIS work. A GIS work plan is provided along with examples, process guidance, case studies, and templates. And we also have a number of tools and data such as the Sea Level Rise Viewer and Marsh Migration Tool, which enables you to answer the question, I wonder if and when sea level rise will impact our wetlands in my area. And finally, the last thing I want to highlight, since we get asked a lot about the effectiveness of green infrastructure, we have assembled a searchable database with over 100 studies and reports looking at the use of green infrastructure to reduce coastal hazard impacts. There are 32 green infrastructure practices included in the database, and you can narrow by the practice, the green infrastructure practice, the coastal hazard. There are 5 different coastal hazards included, the region, the state, or the scale of the practice to get findings from the studies, just a quick synopsis. So be sure to check that out if you're interested. And with that, I think Nicole is up next, and you're going to hear more about some specific on the ground work.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. That was a terrific overview and lots of tools and techniques that are available there. Nicole, maybe you can take us on a quick tour through Maryland's approach to utilizing nature-based approaches.
Yeah, I was excited to hear about the effectiveness database. I'm definitely going to take a look at that. So good afternoon. My name is Nicole Cardozo. I'm a natural resource planner with Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and I also work within the state's Coastal Zone Management Program. I manage the state's Resiliency Through Restoration initiative, which means that we're basically working to elevate the use of natural and nature-based features as adaptation strategies for the state's local communities to assist them with dealing with the impacts of climate change, such as coastal storms or sea level rise. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how Maryland is integrating natural and nature-based features into our community resilience planning and our natural resources management from a state perspective. So Maryland originally developed our strategies for addressing climate change in 2008 and 2011 to deal with a variety of climate change impacts, ranging from coastal hazards to human health, infrastructure impacts, and ecosystem impacts. And those strategies were developed by Maryland's Commission on Climate Change and the Adaptation and Resiliency Work Group. So the website I have up here today is the Commission's website, and there's more information on here about the different work groups that are assisting Maryland with dealing with the impacts of climate change. When we released these strategies, the Commission and the work groups decided that it would be important to address the protection of coastal habitats and natural resources because these resources are being impacted by climate change. Unfortunately, Maryland is one of the more vulnerable states in the country to sea level rise. Following Louisiana and Florida, we've experienced about 1 foot of sea level rise over the past century, and we're planning for 2 additional feet by the year 2050 and up to 3 feet or more by the end of the century if global emissions aren't reduced. And through the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, our scientific technical work group release sea level rise projections every 5 years. So I encourage you to check out their website if you'd like to learn more about those probabilistic projections. So when developing these strategies, the Commission decided that it would be important to develop some policy recommendations related to coastal habitats and sea level rise. So first, they recommended that we become a little bit more strategic in where we're directing our protection and restoration activities in the state. And also that it was important to develop and implement financial incentives and regulations and education and outreach approaches to not only conserve these coastal habitats, but also to expand coastal forests and wetlands to areas that would be suitable for them over the long term. So in response to this, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources adopted a building resilience to climate change policy. And through that policy, basically what we did was we pledged to consider climate change within our land investment, habitat restoration, and infrastructure siting and design activities. And to do that, we developed a number of data sets so we could be sure that we could consider climate change within our natural resources management. So the first data set that was developed was through the Sea Level Affecting Marshes model, or the SLAM model, and we developed these wetland adaptation areas. And these are basically marsh migration areas, so we could better understand where these systems, where these habitats are expected to migrate by the end of the century. And we wanted to be able to better direct our resources towards protecting these areas and also maintaining them and readying them for that natural marsh transition. So once we identified these wetland adaptation areas, we then separated them into low, medium, and high priority wetland adaptation zones. And the image on the screen today is a screenshot of Maryland's lower eastern shore. This is in Dorchester County, and these bright orange areas are the high priority wetland adaptation areas. And this data has been integrated into our land acquisition targeting. And we're also using it in the designation of resilience easements in the state. And our resilience easements are kind of a unique strategy that we're using to preserve these migration areas. And we're working with property owners to set in place wetland adaptation buffer areas, development setbacks, and impervious surface limits in these areas to help with that natural transition of the marsh over time as sea level rise impacts these habitats. So when this data was developed and implemented, right around that time, Hurricane Sandy made landfall on the US East Coast. And while Maryland wasn't among the hardest hit states, we did experience an estimated damages of over $41 million. So there was an interest in not only identifying protection projects to enhance habitat and water quality, but also identifying protection and restoration projects that would provide community resilience benefits for our communities grappling with these coastal storms and sea level rise impacts. So that actually led to the development of another data set, Maryland's Coastal Resiliency Assessment. And the goal of this assessment was really to more proactively identify natural habitats and features on our landscape that currently provide these protection services so that we could better direct our resources towards protecting and enhancing those natural areas. We drew on a number of pre-existing models to complete this assessment. We utilized the Army Corps' North Atlantic Coast Comprehensive Study risk analysis methodology, and we also utilized the Natural Capital Project's Invest Coastal Vulnerability model. And we developed 5 different data layers, some of which have been integrated into our land acquisition targeting. So to see if I can scroll down here. Okay. So we have our shoreline hazard index. Well, it's not letting me scroll, but we have a shoreline hazard index, a habitat role data layer. We also identified a community flood risk area. So these are residential areas that are ranked from low to high risk based on probability of impacts from a flood, as well as population density and social vulnerability demographic data. And then we also developed a priority shoreline data set and a marsh index. And both the priority shoreline data set and the marsh index basically identify shoreline segments and marsh complexes that we think are doing the best job of providing protection services. And those data sets have been integrated into the state's land acquisition targeting. But more importantly for our coastal communities, this data allowed us, or it directly led to the development of a new restoration grant program that's supported through state capital funds. And this is our Resiliency Through Restoration initiative. And this allowed us to implement natural and nature-based projects on the ground to provide community resilience benefits. So it expanded our adaptation strategies from conservation to restoration. And this website has more information about the coastal resiliency assessment. This data, as well as our marsh migration area data set, is available on Maryland's Coastal Atlas, which is our online data viewing platform for coastal data. And that's linked on the left-hand side of this website. So I encourage you to take a look at the documentation and the story maps and the fact sheets that are available through that resource. So Maryland's Resiliency to Restoration Initiative is the unique grant program that I mentioned, where we are funding design, construction, and adaptive management of these nature-based practices with the goal of enhancing the resilience of our coastal communities, economies, and natural resources to deal with the impacts from climate change. And over the short term, we're hoping to demonstrate how nature can play a role in risk reduction by implementing a series of pilot projects across the state. So currently we're working on 16 different projects. They range from living shorelines to thin layer sediment placement and wetland restoration, to also some urban green infrastructure practices that address more frequent and more intense rain events. So we're trying to build our toolbox in Maryland for nature-based practices that can work within the Chesapeake Bay and Coastal Bays areas. The Resiliency to Restoration Initiative has a number of unique components. The first being that we're encouraging innovative design. So a couple examples are the integration of dredge material into these projects, the inclusion of oyster reefs that haven't been really widespread, at least in Maryland's Chesapeake Bay, if not in Virginia. So we're working with practitioners and our coastal communities and our grantees to consider these innovative components. We're also monitoring these projects. And so unique to this program, we have an adaptive management phase. For every project, we're setting aside some funding in case we need to return to this project in the future through that adaptive management cycle and adjust it. So that monitoring data will feed directly into that adaptive management phase. And then lastly, this isn't really unique to this program, but we are working with our coastal communities and our stakeholders to develop communication plans. And because we really want to use these projects as demonstration projects and a communication strategy. And we're also attempting to develop a community science program to pull in local community members and students, not only help with the monitoring of these projects, but also to engage them in a conversation about the benefits of these features. So this website has more information about the grant program and the monitoring efforts. I also wanted to mention that this also links back to some of our broader community resilience efforts through the state's Coastal Zone Management Program. We really work with communities to help understand their vulnerability, to plan for addressing that vulnerability, and then to implement solutions to reduce their risk. And so this program allows us to provide funding and technical assistance for that implementation phase of that cycle. So we were really excited about this program. So the last thing I wanted to talk a bit about today is the research that's underway in Maryland to better understand the benefits of these natural features. And we understand that some communities are uncertain about if green infrastructure can function as well as the gray infrastructure or the gray counterparts, and that there may be some uncertainty about at what threshold this green infrastructure provides benefits or doesn't provide benefits during major storm events. In Maryland, we are dealing with events that range from sunny day, high tide flooding, to nor'easters and coastal storms, to hurricanes that come up the East Coast. So when will these features work and under what conditions will they work or won't work? And so we're working to address those uncertainties through collaborations with different research or institutions and universities. So the first collaboration that I wanted to mention was that we're working with the Chesapeake Bay Natural Estuarine Research Reserve to develop all the monitoring protocols that we're using for these projects and to implement those protocols. And as I mentioned previously, that data will feed back into our adaptive management process, and we will be using that in developing case studies and lessons learned for these projects to continue building that toolbox of nature-based practices for the state of Maryland. We're also partnering with George Mason University and the Nature Conservancy on a project to quantify the benefits, the protection benefits of natural features in the state. So we were lucky enough at the end of last year to receive grant funding through NOAA through their Ecological Effects of Sea Level Rise program. And we're working with both George Mason University as the lead institution and TNC to quantify the wave attenuation and flood reduction benefits of natural features. And we're looking at our coastal wetlands, but we're also looking at seagrass beds and probably a few different living shoreline sites as well to try to quantify this benefit. This project builds off of a previous pilot project with these partners at a site in Maryland's lower eastern shore in the Deal Island community. And the diagram on the screen here was developed as part of that collaboration. It basically shows how we deploy the wave, water level, and current sensors from the estuary inland through the marsh system. And so at this site, we were able to measure water levels, waves, and currents for a season, so a short amount of time. And during one summer event, we noticed a reduction in wave height of up to 90% during that storm event. So we're trying to replicate those types of monitoring efforts across the state to better understand under what conditions these features can or can't provide benefit. This site is also really important for the community because the community identified it as a priority for protecting their main road as well as surrounding residential infrastructure. But this site is currently eroding away at a rapid pace. And so we are actually in the permitting process to put a living shoreline in at this location. And so continuing research collaborations like this will help us to better understand which sites are providing protection, as well as which sites are going to be in trouble with the impacts of sea level rise and where we may need to intervene with restoration action. And with that, I think I'm going to bring this to a close. Thank you for your time, and I will turn things back over to Eric.
Cole, great. That was fabulous. Thank you. And those projects are terrific. I know a little bit from firsthand experience how timely they are, and what good work DNR is doing. We get to turn now to John Day and his presentation. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And let me express my appreciation to the Environmental Law Institute for this award. It's a big honor. And what I'm gonna, let's see. I don't see my presentation. Here we go. So I'm going to step back and take a look at a much broader area and talk about wetlands and disaster resilience in the Mississippi Basin and Delta, focusing on water quality, hurricanes, and Delta restoration. So this is a continental scale view. Let's see here. So what the idea is that water quality, flood threat, and wetland deterioration are linked in the Mississippi Basin, both along the tributaries and down into the Mississippi Delta. And you know, I've worked with a large group of people on addressing these issues over many years. And the solution to these problems are linked and will lead to greater resilience. This says it's advancing very slowly. Well, this is a map of the Mississippi Basin. The drainage basin is one of the 5 largest riverine drainage basins in the world, covering about 3.2 million square kilometers. And here we've in addition to outlining the boundaries of the Mississippi Basin, you see the major tributaries there, the Upper Miss, the Missouri, and the Ohio. The light pink areas are areas with heavy fertilization for corn and soybeans primarily, and a major runoff areas for nitrate into the Mississippi River drainage system. The black dots each indicate about 8,000 acres of enhanced drainage using various techniques off of agricultural areas primarily. And down at the bottom, the darker pink area is the dead zone or the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico that is caused by mainly by agricultural runoff from those pink areas, but also the much larger area. So the question is, how can we deal with a continental scale problem like that? So we've identified three main ecological solutions to overenrichment of the basin. Riparian forest restoration along stream channels, created and restored wetlands in strategic locations in the landscape, and river diversions throughout the basin delta. And a guiding principle for this is that system functioning should be the basis for sustainable management. And I think that came out in a lot of the last two presentations. We need to work with nature. So back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Dr. Bill Mitch and I and a large group of people worked on areas about looking at this whole problem from a landscape level, and we have resulting landscape level recommendations. One is better, we say better fertilizer management here, but really is a better agricultural management of how we grow crops, apply fertilizers, and control runoff. And then the creation and restoration of about 2 million hectares of wetlands within the watershed, within the agricultural landscape, very strategically located to capture flow from runoff, and the important inorganic nutrient is nitrate. And wetlands are very good at taking nitrate out of runoff. And finally, the restoration of riparian bottomlands as stream buffers, about 7.7 million hectares. And we calculated that this would achieve the goals of reducing hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is being applied in many areas. We heard about the effort in Nebraska, but all over the Mississippi Basin, people are looking at implementing projects to put wetlands into agricultural landscapes to reduce nutrient runoff. And I'll just show you a couple of examples of how the landscape has changed that resulted in these problems. On the left here is the original Mississippi River floodplain, and you see it was a wide floodplain that from time to time experienced overflow from the Mississippi River and tributaries. Currently, the floodplain of the river is very much limited by levees and bluffs to a very narrow area that you see on the right here. And so one approach here is to utilize and restore and utilize existing wetlands along the Mississippi Channel and in the lower Mississippi Basin to help improve water quality. So much of the landscape of the Mississippi Basin looked like this, and in the sense that, you know, there were beaver dams that held water on the landscape. There were large areas of wetlands that have been reclaimed for agriculture, and this has changed the Mississippi Basin from an area that conserved nutrients and held floodwaters to one that looks like this, largely where there are huge areas, agricultural areas with subsurface tile drainage, which route runoff water very rapidly off of agricultural fields and into waterways, causing water quality problems not only in the Gulf of Mexico in the hypoxic zone, but throughout the basin, with eutrophication and even nitrate levels reaching levels that are not advised for human consumption. So the creation and restoration of wetlands in the basin would reverse these trends that I'm showing you. And just as an example of some of the changes that also happened in the landscape, the agricultural landscape in the Mississippi Basin has gone from a rather diverse landscape with a variety of crops, as indicated by this 1941 map in a county in Iowa, to one that by the 1990s was dominated by corn and soybeans, and lost much of the diversity. For instance, a lot of hay used to be grown to feed the animals, and now that feed mostly comes from corn and soybeans. So as we move down to where I am, down in the Mississippi Basin, and I'm located just above the coastal zone in this area right here in Baton Rouge, and this shows wetland loss in the basin. This is about a 300-mile wide coastline with about 10 million acres of coastal wetlands originally, and you can see here in the shades of red and yellow show wetland loss in the basin, and that is due to there's an underlying subsidence in most large deltas that is an analog for sea level rise, and that under naturally functioning deltas that would be offset by inputs from rivers as they flooded over the deltas with fresh water, sediments, and nutrients. But we've had two things occur in the Mississippi Basin. One is and let me back up and say there are two main channels now where water flows out of the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. One is the main channel that comes down past New Orleans, and you can see a lot of that water is discharging into deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The other one is the Atchafalaya River, which comes down here. There are new deltas forming in this region, and you see the sediment-laden water is flowing in inshore areas. And on the map, we could see that this area is one of the areas along the coast with very low rates of land loss, where there are very high rates of land loss throughout the rest of the delta. So the other thing is there's been an enormous hydrological alteration. It's pervasive across the whole delta due to channelization, oil and gas activity, drainage, etc. And so the Louisiana has a large coastal restoration program, a 50-year, $50 billion effort to restore this coast. And one of them is a main part of this is putting the river back into the delta. One of the negative impacts of the coast being we're losing so many wetlands and people moving into flood-prone areas is hurricanes. This is a map, a picture of the beginning of flooding from Hurricane Katrina in the New Orleans region. These two big structures are pilings for a high bridge going over a navigation channel that connected the New Orleans area directly to the Gulf of Mexico. And this and there are levees along here. And this shows the beginning of the water overtopping those levees and flowing into areas where people lived. And the result of that, and this shows the result of that flooding in New Orleans. And the gray areas here show the extent of flooding of New Orleans due to Katrina. This is on September 2nd, 2005. The image I showed you just now is right here. There's a bridge over this channel, and this is this large navigation channel that was directly connected to the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see it goes right into the heart of New Orleans. And flooding, much of the flooding was due to this channel, as well as failure of levees. And just to show you the importance of wetlands and hurricane protection, well, this is a house that just shows you the extent of the flooding in much of the New Orleans area. Basically, sea level is right here, and the reason it is because the land was drained, it subsided due to soil oxidation, and when the levees failed, the city filled up. It's a bowl, and many houses, for a long time going around New Orleans, you could see these lines where the floodwaters left marks on houses and other structures. And we know that as you move inland from the coast, hurricane surge is reduced. And this shows a map from the Corps of Engineers, a graph from the Corps of Engineers. On the vertical axis is surge level in feet, and you can see for this particular, well, this is from a number of storms, but that as you move inland, you could see surge anywhere from 10 to 16 feet along the coast. And as you move in 20 miles, that surge is reduced down to about 4 feet. And that much of that is due to these extensive wetlands that exist along the coast. And here, just to show you an example of that, this is that area again. This is that navigation channel that carried floodwaters into New Orleans. I'm going to show you an area. One is here, where there's open water in front of the levees, and an area here where there's oops. This was the area to the south in that image. You can see here a person on top of the levee, and this is the rack line during Katrina. So in this area, the flood level was up 16 to 18 feet. And had the levees worked, most of that water would not have flooded into New Orleans. And you can see here, there are fairly extensive wetlands out in front of this levee that help reduce both surge and waves impacting this levee. If we move to the other location, the storm surge came from this direction. It was open water. It crossed this very deep navigation channel, which was about 35 feet deep, and allowed waves to reform. And these levees were just essentially eroded down to ground surface. And you can see here is sheet piling that was at the center of the levee. So there was a levee across here, and it's essentially completely eroded away, and it allowed the surge to pass freely across and into living areas in the New Orleans metropolitan area. So one of the goals of coastal restoration is recreating and maintaining wetlands as storm surge protection. And this is a forested wetland on the Louisiana-Mississippi line, and it's very close to where the eye passed in Hurricane Katrina. And what you see here in green are cypress swamps along channels. And after the hurricane passed, these trees largely remain standing. And cypress are one of the most resilient trees to being blown down in hurricanes. In the middle of here, in these areas, these are bottomland hardwood species living in a little bit higher elevation, and the high winds from Katrina essentially blew down about 80 to 90% of these. So part of the goal is to restore cypress swamps along in the Mississippi Delta for all sorts of reasons, but one of the main ones is hurricane protection. And this is just a picture of a group of cypress trees that were planted down in southeast of New Orleans. And you see the debris from Hurricane Katrina. There's a refrigerator there about 6 feet above the ground. But these cypress trees that have been planted in that area, they're about 10 years old, and they survived that storm surge. So if you put all that together, we're looking at an integrated basin level solution with large scale wetland creation in the Mississippi Basin to reduce nutrients. It also creates habitat, provides a range of ecosystem services, including flood storage, because and by doing that, it also reduces the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Reconnection of the Mississippi River to the Delta leads to wetland restoration. This lowers flood stages in the river, which are projected to increase with climate change, and indeed already are. We're getting big floods more often. And if any of you know about the Bonnie Carey Spillway, it's a flood relief outlet. It's being opened much more frequently now, and it protects New Orleans from flooding. So it's a way these outlets would reduce flood threats at the same time that they're building and restoring wetlands, and especially cypress swamps. And so that would provide a buffer against hurricane surge and waves, thus enhancing flood protection. So that's an overview of some of the things that I've worked on in the Mississippi Basin and Delta. Thank you very much.
John, that was terrific. Thank you so much for going through that. I'm going to pick up here as soon as the slide comes up. Let's see if here we are. And my presentation is actually going to take up this theme of integrated solutions being the route to go, but do it from a localized scale, not the continental scale that you were talking about. So I'm going to start here talking about a suite of projects and some work that I was involved with at or in near the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Dorchester County. Nicole identified earlier Dorchester as one of those areas on the Chesapeake Bay that is most prone to sea level rise. The circle here on this image indicates the area of both the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, now about 29,000 acres, and an adjacent wildlife management area, the Fishing Bay Wildlife Management Area that the state of Maryland, actually Department of Natural Resources, manages. We did some assessments of what was going on with sea level rise and storm surge in the Chesapeake Bay, and then thought about the implications of that. NOAA funded that research in the early 2000s, and we focused in on the area of high impact that was being shown in Dorchester County, specifically the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, where my organization, the Conservation Fund, had done a fair amount of land protection, land conservation, thinking this was permanent, this was forever. And we quickly realized we needed to change our framework in terms of understanding what was permanent and what was going to be needed for the persistence of valuable ecosystems like coastal marsh systems. So the factors involved in the loss of wetlands within Dorchester County, and particularly within the refuge itself, sea level rise obviously is one of those factors, and the accompanying saltwater intrusion, but it's not the only factor. An invasive South American rodent, the nutria, had been introduced to be grown for its fur back in the 30s, about the time the refuge was created. It was highly invasive and ate out native marsh plants to a great extent, and led to the erosion of a good portion of the then extant marsh. But there are other factors, land subsidence generally, groundwater pumping, and something that nobody's mentioned so far, the isostatic rebound, or the retreat of the last glacier from 10,000 years ago that had this sort of seesaw effect on the land, where the area to the north of the North American continent rose, and this area subsided almost because the weight of the ice was such that it submerged this land lower, and over time, over eons, that land is rising. But clearly, looking forward, the impact of great concern is the rising sea levels. So historically, the bay has seen around 12 inches of sea level rise from the 1900s across the 20th century. As Nicole pointed out earlier in her presentation, the work that the Maryland Climate Commission has done has projected initially a meter, and then recently increased up to about 44 inches as the best estimate of a rise in the Bay Area. We utilized this information to think about what the implications were, and I'll go to a map in a moment, and you'll see a little bit of how these projected out across the landscape. But we tried to come up with a suite of strategies, frankly, that would address the key problem, which is how to preserve, how to do as much as we could to ensure the persistence of this high salt marsh ecosystem that we were in particular focused on. And it is the high marsh in particular. Our great partner through much of this work was the Audubon Society, National Audubon Society, and they were focused on a suite of salt marsh birds that are highly threatened. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was obviously a great partner, Maryland DNR as well. So it was a wildlife perspective that we took on, but it was also from a human community perspective as well. So what we ended up with was a suite of essentially 3 buckets of strategies. I'll use that term buckets because there isn't a single strategy in one. So the long-term strategy, and Nicole touched on this, is to both identify and then protect marsh migration corridors for the future. We know that the marsh is not going to persist where it's currently located by and large. The second set of strategies is managing the marsh transition. It does not move evenly across the landscape to a higher topography. There are things like trees, forests, farmed areas. There are things in its way. So how you manage that, both from the vegetative cover and from a pollution aspect and the extent of development, will matter in terms of the success of the marsh regenerating and replacing itself. And then the third bucket of strategy is a suite of things that can be done to slow the current rate of loss of the marshes. And that's, I think, where both Stephanie and Nicole's comments have centered on what are the suite of techniques that add resiliency through natural and intermediate means. We found, and let me click to the next slide here, which does show a map of the area that we looked at. The areas outlined in dark blue are the 2, and I'll get the second arrow up there. So the arrows show the direction that the marshes will be migrating. This is north, pointing north. Below this is the body of the bay. So Dorchester sits off kind of to the east and slightly north, but the bay runs alongside of it. So the movement here of the sea level rise is shown where the lighter colors, the yellow, the green, are successive levels moving into orange and red over 25-year time increments, starting when we did this work back in 2010. But what we found at that time when we did the assessment of the high marsh that was the target of our assessment and our strategy development for salt marsh protection, because this was the high marsh that was favored by the salt marsh birds. We moved from a current level in 2010 of around a little over 9,000 acres of the then 26 and change thousand acre National Wildlife Refuge to 512 acres by 2100 in these 25-year time increments. For the Fishing Bay area, a larger area, was about 29,000, and I think at the time there were about 25,000 acres of high marsh, high and medium marsh. There were 0. That told us, taking those 2 principal areas that were conserved, this landscape is going to change dramatically because of projected sea level rise. Now, the 25-year increments were taken by convenience. It may not move in such a even linear fashion, but it really would benefit from, again, going to that suite of techniques from a series of approaches. back in the, and I don't know if I go back here. Yeah. So this image actually shows a dredge that was being used a few years ago. We were lucky to get some of the dollars, the resiliency dollars that were provided by the Department of Interior to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation for projects that would enhance resiliency through use of green or natural infrastructure techniques. So we did a sizable thin layer marsh restoration project on a section of Blackwater Refuge, about 40 acres, and this image shows that process happening, the sediment being moved. But this slide indicates a more recent acquisition that we executed on behalf of Fish and Wildlife Service. We acquired a privately owned parcel in, going back one, this Coursey Creek corridor, as we called it. It's the one to the left of the image here. That is an area that we predict, based on our assessment, can grow to from a current fairly small level of wetlands. I think they're in the nature of 400 to 500 acres of wetlands now, to over 2,500 acres by 2100. So this is an area, because of the change of the upland landscape into marsh, where, and it's also partially within the refuge boundaries now, with the recent acquisition even more so. That is an area to sustain and allow that salt marsh ecosystem to persist. And not incidentally, in that same corridor, right to the edge of the existing Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, is a new interpretive center run by the Maryland Park Service and the National Park Service, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Memorial. I mention this because it underscores how important these marshes are, not just for their ecological benefits, but for the cultural heritage, for the connection with the social fabric of the place, and even I would say of the country. These aren't areas that are just functional from an ecologic. They don't provide us just ecosystem services, but they provide us spiritual and historical and cultural services as well. So I just want to end there with this quick tour through this project, how these, and we carried out other pilot projects. We looked at early removal of salt stress trees and took them out to see if that helped to ease marsh transition. We planted switchgrass on agricultural areas that were beginning to go fallow because of saltwater intrusion that prevented corn and soy from growing in those areas. We sprayed Phragmites to reduce its ability to dominate the landscape and prevent native plants from taking over. We helped fund the nutria eradication program, which took care of eliminating the threat of an invasive animal species from harming the new marsh that was trying to form. All of these things are part of the necessary actions that are needed for a complex problem like the loss of coastal marsh. John laid that out even more so on the continental scale, talking about the Mississippi River Basin and the contribution of nutrients coming from hundreds and more miles away and impacting the health of that ecosystem. So it's not a simple problem. You can't do just one thing or think in a very time-fixed linear fashion. But I do think, and this is what this slide said, is we need to start acting today for climate resiliency tomorrow. If we wait until we know everything or everything is perfectly proven, we won't have the time to do much to save valuable ecosystems. So there, I think I'll end, Caitlin, and I think we should be right about on time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric. So
And
as a reminder to everybody, you can enter your questions using GoTo's question box.
so while I'm waiting for you to serve up questions from the audience, I just wanted to follow up with John, since I brought everything down to a hyper-local scale. John, I'm just wondering, I know your work over the years has encompassed systems elsewhere outside of the United States. Are there analogous challenges that are being met with a mix of natural and engineered solutions, other river basins that are looking at similar challenges from sea level rise that you've experienced? Are there things that we can learn here from those experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I spent a year in the south of France working on the Rhone Delta, and from that I got involved in the Rhone Delta, Italy, and and out of that, working with a number of colleagues, developed this idea of the importance of these energetic forcings at a different spatial and temporal scales. You know, from river changes of river channels to intense storms like hurricanes, to frontal passages, to big river floods. And in fact, I'm still publishing on some of those areas. And what we found across the board is where there was good riverine input into delta areas, those were the ones that were most sustainable. And this is being implemented to some extent in all of these deltas. They in the Ebro Delta, they're converting some rice fields back to wetlands to clean up water running off the rice fields, and at the same time, this is leading to enhanced productivity and accretion to offset sea level rise. So yeah, it's a very similar set of problems and a very similar set of solutions.
Thanks, John. And Nicole, I wanted to follow up with you as well. You mentioned in passing the resiliency easement as an innovative tool that the state of Maryland is using. I wonder if you could add a little bit more detail on that. I know you were trying to get through your presentation in the time we had, but I think that would be of interest in particular to this audience with many lawyers involved. How is that working? Are landowners receptive? What is the financial incentive that is needed for individuals to impose an easement of that sort on their land?
Yeah, so we recognize that a lot of these marsh transition zones, marsh migration areas are on private properties. A lot of that is agriculture. A lot of that is being used for agriculture, and as those fields are becoming, too wet to have sustainable agricultural practices, they're going to be either abandoned, or practices are going to have to be put in place to continue that agricultural use. And so we decided that we should try to target some of these areas and see if property owners would be receptive to placing easements on those properties, which basically means that those areas that are too wet to farm, they're going to be allowed to transition back to wetland areas, and we're going to be instituting buffers around those wetland adaptation areas to allow that natural habitat to migrate inland. So the first easement was actually put in place right before I came to the department, back in 2010, 2012 timeframe. And that was the pilot easement. And at the time, there was talk about developing a management plan for the property owner, but the property owner in question was not interested in additional restrictions and developing a management plan. So the easement went forward, but we think it was a missed opportunity for that management plan. So we're kind of reinvigorating the program right now, and we have some opportunities for additional easements, and we're actually going through right now and reviewing that management plan and deciding what type of guidance needs to be in there, what type of what types of plants should be planted, what types of invasive control needs to be included, similar, Eric, to what you were talking about with Blackwater. So while we haven't had a lot of interest so far, I think that people are thinking about this a lot right now, and they're a little bit more receptive because they're seeing the impacts of an increase in nuisance flooding. I think there was a NOAA report out from, I think it was 2015, 16, that, sunny day flooding in the Baltimore and Annapolis areas has increased by over 900% since the 60s. I mean, folks are seeing the impacts of this. So while we haven't had as much interest in the past, I think there will be interest moving forward, especially if we talk about the co-benefits of these practices, not only the protection benefits, but a lot of people do care about the habitat. They live in those areas because they like to see the ospreys and the natural vegetation. So I'm trying to talk about those co-benefits will be really important.
Stephanie, let me draw you into the conversation as well. And you were going through a number of the techniques that NOAA has identified and is promoting. Question for you, and Nicole may have some insight on this as well, because I believe that some of the suggestions are to try this. Have you seen instances of a stacking of these natural and or green infrastructure techniques at one location, multiple techniques being used in one place, and what's the evaluation of those? The marsh protection, say, and a living shoreline, for example. Are you starting to see more of that? Is that something that NOAA is also promoting? And same question to you, Nicole, in terms of DNR's approach.
Thanks, Eric. Yes, we are starting to see more of our stakeholders and our partners using a suite of methods to try to increase resilience and protect existing wetlands and private lands and communities. So we do see, for example, in one of the slides I showed with Charleston, you'll have conservation of existing marsh, and if nearby marsh has eroded, they'll put in a living shoreline to help expand that marsh, and then behind the marsh they'll do some sort of easement or green park or something that allows more migration of the marsh inland and or more buffering of floodwaters and waves and things like that. So we are starting to see stacking, and of course a lot of times those do have some gray infrastructure as well to help them get the maximum benefit. But yes, we are starting to see definitely more detailed adaptation plans that have a number of solutions included.
Great, thanks. Nicole, I don't know if you had anything to add to that, and then I want to turn back to Caitlin, see if she's got some questions for us.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add from a coastal zone management perspective, we really encourage the local communities to plan comprehensively. So to not just think of one solution, but think about that suite of practices, whether they're green, gray, or hybrid practices, depending on what you're trying to protect. What is that suite of practices? And from a funding perspective, I think historically it was very much piecemeal. I'm thinking about a project we're currently funding thin layer sediment placement design at the Chesapeake Bay Environmental Center. And previously they've had an oyster reef put in and a living shoreline, and now they're doing thin layer sediment placement. So it was very piecemeal, but I think a lot of the funding agencies are kind of trying to move towards having that comprehensive look, so that even if we're only funding one project in a suite, the community understands, where they're going moving forward.
Great, thanks. Caitlin, do we have any questions coming in?
We certainly do. So this first question is for Stephanie. In Louisiana, we are seeing the first federally subsidized program, HUD, for resettling residents due to rising sea levels and coastal erosion/evulsion. Do you see retreat or resettling as a potential part of NOAA Coastal Management's strategic plan for the future?
That's a great question. And yes, I think ultimately a lot of communities are going to be up against relocation, but a lot of them are not there yet. I think we do encourage with adaptation planning communities to consider, like Nicole said, multiple options. And right now it may just be addressing the most imminent threats to a community, but ultimately there may be no other solution due to property damages and or just loss of land. So yes, that is definitely in the sort of one of the buckets, as Eric mentioned, of adaptation measures that we talk about.
Thank you, Stephanie. We have another question from a participant who would like to learn more about Maryland's adaptive management funding. For example, where does this money come from? How is it managed, etc.?
Yeah, so historically, a lot of the funding in Maryland has been for water quality benefits. So we have a TMDL, which is pretty much like a pollution diet for the bay. So a lot of our funding has gone towards best management practices to address water quality. And our new resiliency through restoration funding is actually funded through our state capital dollars through general obligation bonds. So we're not sure what that's going to look like this year with the coronavirus impacting all of the state budgets, but we did have over a 5-year period planned for over $16 million in this funding pot. And we have applicants apply through our grants gateway, and most of them come in for design grants, and then we walk those projects through from design to construction to adaptive management. Some folks do come in for design build or just for construction grants, but if they come in for construction, then we want to make sure that they demonstrate how sea level rise has been considered within the design of their project. So this is pretty new and innovative, I think, for Maryland and many of the states that have capital dollars put towards design and construction. And so we're hoping that we can get some demonstration projects on the ground later this year, fingers crossed. And then we definitely will be sharing the fruits of that labor with everybody.
Thank you, Nicole. So we have a question for the panel at large. To what extent do you see these resiliency programs working in the greater context of everything going on in a balance with the fossil fuel emissions that are not, being rapidly phased out?
John, you want to take the first whack at that one?
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know if just this week, the Mauna Loa Observatory noted that we reached a new high in CO2 levels, 418 parts per million. And the momentum built into climate change, even if we were to stop increasing CO2 levels, is going to be, we're going to have enormous impacts. And I think not only the impacts will grow, and the resources to deal with them won't keep up. And so we're going to be facing hard choices, and I think it's inevitable that people are going to have to move away from the coast.
We had a discussion just on a climate resiliency work group, part of the Chesapeake Bay program's advisory bodies, and one of the discussions of an area of needed research was a little bit more detail on the creation of blue carbon, the role that wetlands protection can play, a little bit more precise information in terms of conserving methane in the soils, of sequestering additional carbon by the native wetland plants. That information exists, but it's a little bit spotty, and it's not as well developed for carbon models as, say, forestry carbon is. So to provide some additional incentive for private investment in coastal wetlands protection, that occurred to us as that would be a good area to focus some research on. So I think there are some additional research areas where more information is needed. I think we've just begun to scratch the surface on how to utilize the best approaches of enhancing, restoring green infrastructure and the role that it plays, but also in the financing part of it. I think the financing is key. Delighted to see the state of Maryland stepping forward and putting some real funding into these approaches, but that's somewhat of a rarity, quite frankly.
Yeah, Eric, you mentioned blue carbon, and that's an area that a lot of the National Estuarine Research Reserves are starting to do some additional research to try to learn more about what that capacity is of our wetlands around the country and our estuaries. You're right, there's not a lot of data there, not like the forestry models that there are.
Right.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, in Maryland, we have a greenhouse gas reduction plan, so we are trying to meet, you know, we are trying to meet those emission standards for the Paris Agreement. But I don't know, you know, I'm sure there are other states that have similar approaches, but a lot of our discussion comes around how do we conduct mitigation and adaptation activities together and not conduct those in silo. And I think that the blue carbon discussion gets at that.
Right, right. Yeah, that's what occurred to us, is that it begins to get both the mitigation but also the adaptation piece.
And we have a suite of tools through NOAA. Oh, go ahead, John.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to mention, we've got a suite of tools and the studies, like the ecological effects of sea level rise that Nicole mentioned through NOAA, that we have our sea level rise viewer and marsh migration viewer and things like that. These tools that just help communities at least get an initial grasp of where the problems might come in, and that hopefully helps them kick off those adaptation plans and figure out at least where to focus.
Yeah, I just wanted to say we actually had a project where nutrient-rich water was running off into wetlands, and we measured a net increase in carbon sequestration, so as well as by enhancement, productivity, and accretion.
That's great. Wow, that's interesting to know. That certainly, you know, with the Bay TMDL, that would be that's an area to look at in terms of wetlands capture. I know there's concern within the Bay program about the projected loss of wetlands and the pollution abatement role that they currently play and what the implications are for future watershed improvement plans. So it's a very dynamic situation, John, but that's reassuring to hear.
Thank you. And John, we have another question for you. One of our participants asks if you could tell us why cypress trees better withstand storm surges.
It's not that what people have found out is that cypress trees are one of the trees that are least likely to be blown down by hurricane force winds. It's because they have, you know, not a lot of cross-section area of foliage, and also that the wood is very pliant as opposed to pine, which is brittle. And so it's something that's been noted over and over, is the structure of cypress trees is such that it's less likely to be blown down. They also have this enormous interlocking root system that in a cypress swamp that interacts between the different trees and it's sort of interwoven.
And it's interesting with cypress and some of the other maritime forest species, and I know y'all see that in Maryland. We see it here too. A lot of times when you get saltwater intrusion, whether it's from sea level rise or whether it's from hurricane inundation, storm inundation, it's not necessarily you lose a certain number to the wind right off the bat, but that saltwater intrusion can weaken them over time and make them more susceptible to other problems.
Absolutely.
Thanks all. Well, I think many of us have heard about Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay, and it's largely seen as ground zero for sea level rise and potential erosion of this island that's home to, a whole community of people. Do any of you think that improved wetlands could defend this island? And is there such a plan in place for this area or areas like it?
Nicole, you want to try that one?
So yeah, at Tangier in Virginia. So we have at least one island in Maryland, similar situation, Smith Island, where the island is eroding away, and there are efforts in place to utilize nature-based practices, hybrid practices, growing a number of solutions. They did receive funding through Hurricane Sandy funding to implement some of those solutions. So, I mean, I'm sure that these islands could be saved. It's just a matter of how much money you would have put into it, and having the support of the community as well.
Yeah, there is an effort on the Wicomico to utilize dredged sediment. Nicole, I think you had mentioned that earlier, in a beneficial use manner to help elevate declining wetlands, and the wetlands tend to collapse from within rather than necessarily erode at the edge all the time. So it lends itself to that, and potentially with a living shoreline, that could be an approach. But yeah, the island communities are really challenged, quite frankly, in the bay. There have been quite a few islands already that have simply been lost. Clearly, these are valuable areas, but it's hard to imagine putting seawalls and protecting them. The nature-based approaches can go just so far, I think, in terms of protecting the existing communities that exist on very low-lying land, but there's nothing fundamentally that they can do to change where they sit in the tidal plain. You can defend the edges better, but you can't really elevate them to the extent that would be needed, particularly if you're looking at close to 4 feet of eventual sea level rise in the bay. I mean, I think that's a challenge beyond our understanding right now. More in the approach of what John was identifying with Katrina. That's a constant Katrina.
It's interesting, in Louisiana, we have there is a whole list of places that don't exist anymore, both human, settlements, but also streams that the land around them have eroded away, that they're not on map. They don't exist in reality anymore. Interesting.
Yeah, it comes down to that these are really rural areas with very low tax base and low population. So it's a matter of priorities and how much funding you're willing to put into a location.
Thanks all. I think we have time for just one more question. So have any of the panelists collaborated with state and/or local emergency management agencies or hazard mitigation planners on any plans or projects? For example, have any of you worked with hazard mitigation planners to integrate natural infrastructure projects into hazard mitigation plans?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eric.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, with the Dorchester County work, it's been more local authorities, so the local emergency management are involved with some of those areas, but not. I don't think at the state level at this point that the primary impetus is coming from agencies like the Department of Natural Resources, which is pretty active in coordinating with other state agencies. So they've been the lead, and it's not without any input from those emergency management agencies, but it's just they're not the lead in doing these longer term preventative projects.
Right. And I would
Yeah.
say from NOAA's perspective, it's the same. We try to engage those kinds of managers, the emergency managers, when we're working on these projects with communities and with states. But there is a challenge in mission, right? And who's on first for what activities and what their typical funding streams are. And I know that what we are starting to see is a lot more opportunity for us and for our stakeholders to partner with agencies like FEMA on natural and nature-based features for resilience. And that really is starting to take hold, especially after the past few hurricane seasons.
Yeah, I think there's a new FEMA program, the brick building resistance in communities. Is that the right?
Yes, that's the right one.
Got
I know
that
I
right.
saw some FEMA folks on the attendees list, so I'm sure they can speak much
Yeah,
more
yeah.
broadly about it. But
think
yeah,
that's a good program.
we have a number of our coastal zone management agencies and the reserves that are working on some data points to try to get at the types of economic information that program needs, you know, for the cost benefit analysis and things like that. So yeah, and it's really great to see that they're starting to move into the pre-disaster realm with those types of solutions as well.
Nicole, I don't know if you
Yeah,
were
in
going to.
Maryland, oh yeah, I was just going to add, generally, you know, we are coordinating with Maryland Emergency Management Agency through the Adaptation and Resiliency Work Group, through the State's Resiliency Partnership, which is like a separate work group where different agencies and government partners and nonprofits get together to talk about the funding sources that are available, the communities that need help, the resources that are available. So we're always talking with them when a project comes in, would this best fit under hazard mitigation or under DNR's community resilience program?
Just a comment. It's been my experience to date, and I think this is changing. The attitudes are changing, but there's perhaps a bit more of the educational mission that's needed for, say, NOAA's work in terms of the efficacy of these natural infrastructure techniques to substitute for structural measures. Emergency management agencies often would use elevation of structures as the best approach and the most cost-effective versus maybe a more natural infrastructure. So there may be some more missionary work that's needed to acquaint the emergency management groups with how effective these natural green infrastructure approaches are.
Yes, for sure. We do try to engage them in things like those workshops, the trainings, more and more. It's help us spread the word by all means.
Well, thank you all so much. And I'm sorry that we can't continue these conversations that are so useful and really eye-opening for all of us and for our participants. An enormous thank you so much to our outstanding panelists. We're so appreciative of you sharing your expertise with us for today's webinar. And thank you to our participants for joining us. We appreciate you sending in such great questions. We do encourage you to continue to follow the developments presented today and to celebrate with us the amazing achievements of the National Wetland Award winners. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.